Welcome to New American Mythos, where old stories are kindled like firelight, and we gather round to remember the tales that shaped us. Tonight we return to Sleepy Hollow. The sun has set, the feast will come and go, and the dark road home lies before us, winding through shadows and haunted groves. In this second part of Washington Irving's enduring tale, the line between fear and faith begins to blur. Our schoolmaster, Ichabod Crane, finds himself no longer in the company of neighbors and songs, but of silence, memory, and perhaps a rider. This episode steps into the twilight of early America, where belief and doubt shared the same firelight, and ghost stories were more than entertainment. They gave voice to the unspoken, born from memories of war, unsettled lands, and the uneasy quiet of a new nation. The Revolution had left behind more than victory. Its conflict lingered in the hills, in graves without markers, in rumors of soldiers never returned, in landscapes still carrying the weight of battle. Long before monuments, there were stories, and some of them rode out at night. The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving, Part 2. It was, as I've said, a fine autumn day. The sky was clear and calm, and nature wore the golden robe of harvest time. The woods were dressed in sober browns and yellows, and some delicate trees tinged to fiery hues, orange, scarlet, and purple, by the early frost. Strings of wild ducks passed overhead. From the groves of beech and hickory came the chatter of squirrels, and from the nearby stubble field, now and then, the wistful whistle of a quail. The smaller birds were enjoying their last feasts of the season. Full of glee, they darted from bush to bush and tree to tree, giddy from the abundance around them. There was the trusty cock robin, the favorite prey of young hunters, with his loud and cranky call. Flocks of blackbirds flew in inky clouds. The golden-winged woodpecker flashed his crimson crest and glossy plumage. The cedar bird sported red-tipped wings and a yellow-edged tail, topped with its little crested Montero cap, and the noisy, vain blue jay, dressed in powder blue and white, screeched and strutted, bowing and nodding as if friends with every songbird in the grove. As Ichabod plodded along toward the Van Tassel farm, his ever-hungry eye scanned the land for signs of good food. He beheld an autumn paradise. Apple trees bent under the weight of fruit, some still clinging to branches, others piled in baskets or stacked for cider making. Fields of Indian corn stood golden, their ears peeking from leafy wraps, promising cakes and hasty pudding. Yellow pumpkins glowed beneath them, round and ripe, promising the most sumptuous pies. He passed the sweet-scented fields of buckwheat, which smelled of honey, and in his mind's eye he pictured delicate slapjacks, richly buttered, drenched in syrup or honey, and served, of course, by the dainty hand of Katrina Van Tassel. So, entertaining himself with these sweet thoughts and, quote, sugared suppositions, end quote, he followed the road along a range of hills, overlooking some of the finest scenery along the mighty Hudson. The sun wheeled lower in the western sky. The broad expanse of the Tappan Zee, which was the bay, lay still and shining, with only a few gentle ripples disturbing the reflection of distant mountains. A handful of amber clouds drifted overhead, motionless in the calm. The horizon glowed gold, shading into apple green, then deepening into the dark blue of the upper sky. One slanted sunbeam lingered on the wooded cliffs overhanging the river, making the dark rock faces look even richer in shadow and hue. A lone sloop drifted with the tide, its sails slack as if suspended in the glowing air. It was toward evening when Ichabod arrived at the castle of the Heir Van Tassel, which was already teeming with the pride and flower of the surrounding countryside. They were old farmers, a leathery-faced, wiry lot, dressed in homespun coats and breeches, blue stockings, huge shoes, and proudly polished pewter buckles. Their brisk, wrinkled wives wore tightly crimped caps, long-waisted bodices, and homespun petticoats, with scissors and pincushions and gaily patterned pockets hanging outside. Buxom lasses, almost as matronly as their mothers, wore hats with bright ribbons or white frocks, hinting at the creeping influence of city fashions. The sons were dressed in square-cut coats with rows of oversized brass buttons, their hair tied up in queues, preferably with eel skin, a substance believed in those parts to be a potent tonic for growing thick, strong hair. Brom Bones, of course, was the star of the occasion, having arrived on his favorite steed, Daredevil, a creature as wild and daring as its rider, and which no one else could handle. Brom actually preferred unruly horses, full of tricks and danger, disdaining the calm, well-trained type as unworthy of a truly spirited lad. I would linger if I could to describe the feast that delighted Ichabod's eye when he entered the grand parlor of Van Tassel's house. Not the rosy-cheeked lasses, but the table groaning under the abundance of a Dutch autumn tea. There were heaping platters of cakes, many of them mysterious in shape and recipe, known only to seasoned Dutch housewives. There were mighty donuts, tender ollie koek, crisp, crumbling crullers, sweet cakes and shortcakes, ginger and honey cakes, and the whole tribe of baked delights. And then came pies, apple, peach, pumpkin, and also slices of ham and smoked beef, dishes of preserved plums, peaches, pears, and quinces, not to mention broiled shad, roasted chickens, bowls of milk and cream, all jumbled together as I've listed them, with the teapot in the center, merrily steaming. Heaven help me, I can hardly breathe for listing them all. But Ichabod, thankfully, was in no such hurry and did full justice to every treat. Ichabod was a kind and grateful soul, whose heart swelled in proportion to how well he was fed. His spirits rose with eating, just as some men's do with drink. He could not help rolling his large eyes about the room as he dined, chuckling at the notion that he might someday be master of all this nearly unimaginable luxury and comfort. When that day came, he thought, he would gladly leave behind the humble schoolhouse, snap his fingers at Hans von Ripper and every stingy patron, and send any wandering schoolteacher packing who dare call him colleague. Old Balthus Van Tassel moved through his guests with a face beaming with good cheer, round and merry as the harvest moon. His hospitality was simple but sincere. A firm handshake, a hearty slap on the shoulder, a booming laugh, and a friendly, "Come in and help yourselves." Soon music rose from the hall, summoning everyone to the dance. The fiddler was an old, gray-headed black man who had served as the traveling musician to the area for over 50 years. His fiddle was as aged and worn as he was. Most of the time he scraped along on 2 or 3 strings, bowing almost to the floor and stamping his foot for emphasis whenever a new couple took the floor. Let's take our first break here. Autumn carries more than just harvest in its air. It carries memory of battlefields, of untamed lands, of treaties broken and dreams deferred. Sleepy Hollow sits on that seam between old and new, peace and guilt. Here at the Van Tassel house, the revelry echoes with something older. Stories of war blend into stories of ghosts. The revolution had ended, but not all wounds had closed. The shadows that cling to the glen are not just of the trees. And this reminds us that in America we often say we started fresh. But stories like these remind us that in some sense, we began already haunted. Let's return to the tale. Ichabod prided himself on his dancing as much as on his singing. No part of him was still when the music played, not a limb or a muscle. To see his loosely hung frame flailing about the room, one would think St. Vitus himself, the patron saint of dancing, had appeared in person. He became the idol of all the black onlookers who had gathered from the farms and nearby houses. They crowded the doorways and windows, forming a gleaming pyramid of grinning faces, eyes wide with delight, teeth flashing as they laughed and cheered. How could the stern schoolmaster not feel joyful? The woman of his dreams was his partner in the dance, smiling graciously at all his admiring glances. Meanwhile, Brom Bones, burning with jealousy, sulked alone in a corner. After the dancing ended, Ichabod was drawn to a group of older gentlemen sitting with Van Tassel on the porch, smoking and swapping stories of earlier times, especially from the war. This region, during the Revolutionary War, had been full of action and notable figures. The British and American lines had run close by, and the area had seen its share of raids and border skirmishes with loyalist, quote, cowboys and other roving fighters. Enough time had passed since the war to allow each storyteller to embellish his tale with some creative flourishes and to remember himself as the hero of every daring episode. For instance, there was the tale of Dofu Martling, a giant, blue-bearded Dutchman who nearly captured a British ship with an old iron 9-pounder cannon fired from a muddy barricade until the gun burst on the 6th shot. Then there was a certain unnamed gentleman, too wealthy to mention lightly, who claimed during the Battle of White Plains to have deflected a musket ball with a small sword, actually feeling it glance off the hilt. He was always ready to display that sword, slightly bent at the guard, as proof. Many others present had similarly helped, quote, bring the war to a happy conclusion, end quote, or so they all believed. But these stories were nothing compared to the ghost tales that followed. This neighborhood was rich in supernatural lore, nurtured by the stability and age of the old Dutch settlements. Such tales rarely survive in newer villages, where families move too often for ghosts to find anyone left to haunt. Perhaps that's why most ghost stories flourish in these long-settled enclaves. Still, the main reason for the abundance of supernatural tales in this region was surely its nearness to Sleepy Hollow. The very air seemed infected with dreams and fancies. Several residents of Sleepy Hollow were at the party, sharing their eerie legends. Many spoke of ghostly funeral processions and sorrowful wails heard near the ancient tree where the ill-fated Major Andre had been captured, a local landmark. Others mentioned the woman in white who haunted Raven Rock, known to scream on winter nights before storms. She had, it was said, perished in a snowdrift there. Yet most stories turned on the region's favorite specter, the Headless Horseman, lately seen roaming the countryside and said to tie up his phantom steed among the gravestones in the churchyard each night. That secluded churchyard had long been a haunt for troubled spirits. The church itself stood on a little rise, surrounded by locust trees and tall elms, its clean white walls glowing modestly from among the greenery, like Christian virtue shining in a hidden retreat. A gentle slope led down to a small lake ringed with trees, through which one could glimpse the distant blue hills of the Hudson. The grassy yard basked in quiet sun, seeming to promise peace for the dead. To one side of the church stretched a wooded dell, through which ran a tumbling brook between rocks and fallen trees. A wooden bridge once spanned the darkest part of this stream, not far from the church. The overhanging trees gave it a deep gloom even in daylight, and at night it was positively haunted. This was one of the Headless Horseman's favorite haunts, the place he was most often seen. There was the tale of the old Brower, a notorious skeptic of the tale, who was forced to ride behind the horseman after meeting him late one night, returning from Sleepy Hollow. They galloped wildly over brush and swamp, hill and hollow until they reached the bridge, where the horseman turned into a skeleton, hurled Brower into the brook, and vanished with a thunderclap into the treetops. This tale was immediately topped by a fantastic story from Brom Bones himself, who mocked the Headless Horseman as nothing more than a ghostly jockey. He swore that on returning one night from the village of Sing Sing, he had been challenged by the specter to a race for a bowl of punch, and would have won too, for Daredevil easily outran the ghost horse. But just as they reached the church bridge, the specter bolted and disappeared in a flash of fire. All these tales, told in that low, drowsy tone men often use when talking in the dark, where the only light came from an occasional flash of a pipe, sank deep into Ichabod's imagination. He returned the favor with long passages from his cherished source, Cotton Mather, and added strange occurrences from his native Connecticut, including fearful sights he claimed to have seen during his night walks around Sleepy Hollow. At last the revels wound down. The old farmers gathered their families into wagons and rolled off along the hollow roads and over distant hills. Some of the young women rode home on pillions, which is like a small extra saddle, behind their favored suitors, their cheerful laughter mixing with the clatter of hooves as it echoed through the woods, fading into silence as the night deepened. The once lively scene was left quiet and deserted. Let's take another quick break here. Remember, Ichabod is not a wicked man, but he is vain, soft, and full of foolish hunger. As the laughter of the party fades, the shadows begin to grow. He will leave the Van Tassel house not in triumph, but in confusion. His imagination, once a delight, becomes his undoing. Without roots, without clarity of soul, even a clever man like Ichabod can be easily led astray by fear. And this is the drift, the danger of ambition without ballast. A conscience unanchored invites anything to take the reins. Let's return to the story. Ichabod lingered, as country lovers often do, hoping for a private word with the heiress, now fully confident that victory was his. What passed in that final conversation I do not know, but something, I fear, did not go as he expected. For he emerged, shortly afterward, looking dejected and downcast. Ah, women. Had Katrina merely been teasing him all along? Had she led him on only to ensnare another? Heaven knows, not I. Suffice it to say, Ichabod crept away like a man who had raided a henhouse, not wooed a lady's heart. Without so much as a glance at the rich farmland he had so often fantasized about, he made for the stable and rudely roused his steed from sleep with cuffs and kicks, disturbing its dreams of endless fields of clover and oats. It was the very witching hour of night, which is usually between midnight and 3 a.m., when it is believed that spirits are most present. Ichabod, crestfallen and heavy-hearted, began the ride home along the high ridges above Tarrytown, the same he had traversed so cheerfully that very afternoon. Now the hour matched his mood. Far below, the Tappan Zee stretched out in a dusky, shapeless expanse, with only the dark masts of sloops visible near the shore. In the dead hush of midnight, he could hear the distant bark of a watchdog across the Hudson, so faint and vague it only deepened his sense of isolation. Occasionally, a rooster's long crow would echo from some hidden farmstead in the hills, like a sound from a dream. Nearer at hand came only the lonely chirp of a cricket, or the sleepy grunt of a bullfrog in a marsh, each one adding to his sense of unease. All the ghost stories from earlier in the evening came crowding back to him. The night grew darker still, the stars seemed to sink from sight, and thick clouds now and then covered even their dim light. Never had he felt so forlorn and unnerved. He was now drawing near the very places where many of those tales had been set. He came to a towering tulip tree, vast and gnarled, a known landmark in the region. Its twisted limbs, some as thick as normal tree trunks, curled both downward and upward in ghostly forms. This tree was tied to the tragic story of Major Andre, captured nearby during the war, and was universally known as Major Andre's tree. The locals regarded it with a mix of reverence and dread, partly in sympathy, partly because of the eerie tales told about it. As Ichabod approached the tree, he began to whistle, but thought he heard an echo. It was only the wind rustling through the dry branches. A moment later, he imagined something white hanging in the tree. He paused and stopped whistling, but on closer inspection saw it was just a scar left by a lightning strike. Suddenly, a low groan made his teeth chatter and his knees shake, but that was only one massive limb rubbing against another in the breeze. He passed the tree in safety, but worse lay ahead. Some 200 yards beyond the tree, a small brook crossed the road, flowing into a shadowy hollow called Wiley's Swamp. A few rough logs laid side by side formed a crude bridge. On the far banks, oaks and chestnuts, tangled with wild grapevines, created a dark and cavernous gloom. This bridge was a dreaded spot. It was here that Major Andre had been taken, ambushed by local militiamen hiding in those very bushes. Ever since, the stream had been considered haunted, and schoolboys still dreaded crossing it after dark. As Ichabod neared the brook, his heart pounded. He gathered his courage, kicked Gunpowder sharply, and tried to charge across. But instead of charging forward, the stubborn old horse veered sideways and crashed into the fence. Ichabod, growing frantic, pulled the reins the other way and kicked furiously, but Gunpowder only lurched into a thicket of brambles. At last, the schoolmaster lashed both whip and heel into the bony flanks of the horse, who snorted and lunged ahead, but stopped again just at the bridge, so abruptly that Ichabod nearly flew over his head. Just then, a splash in the stream caught Ichabod's ear. In the gloom on the edge of the brook, he saw something massive and shapeless standing still. It did not move, but loomed darkly, like some monster waiting to pounce. Ichabod's hair stood on end. What was he to do? It was too late to flee, and what hope did he have of escaping a ghost who could fly like the wind? Summoning what little courage he had, he stammered out, Who are you?" There was no reply. He repeated the question more fearfully. Still, no answer. Once more he struck Gunpowder, shut his eyes, and began singing a psalm tune in desperation. Just then the shadowy figure stirred, then sprang into the road with a thud. Though the night was dark, Ichabod could now make out its form, a large man on a massive black horse. The stranger made no move to speak or threatened. He merely kept pace with Ichabod, riding on the blind side of old Gunpowder, who seemed at last to have recovered his nerve. Ichabod, who had no taste for this strange midnight companion, now recalled Brom Bones' tale of the galloping Hessian. He spurred his horse in hopes of outpacing the figure, but the stranger's horse matched his speed. Ichabod slowed to a walk, thinking to fall behind, but the other rider did the same. Dread crept in. He tried to resume his psalm singing, but his dry tongue clung to the roof of his mouth. The silent persistence of this ominous rider was deeply unsettling. Then came the terrible revelation. As they crested a rise, the silhouette of the mysterious figure stood out against the sky, tall, cloaked, and headless. Worse still, Ichabod saw that the head, instead of resting on the rider's shoulders, was carried before him, balanced on the pommel of his saddle. Terror seized Ichabod. He rained down kicks and blows on Gunpowder, desperate to flee. The specter surged forward alongside him, and away they flew, through mud, over stones, sparks flying at every bound. Ichabod's flimsy garments whipped in the wind as he stretched himself flat over his horse's neck, straining for speed. They reached the road leading through Sleepy Hollow, but Gunpowder, seemingly possessed, veered sharply in the opposite way, down a steep hill into a tree-lined sandy hollow. This path led to the very bridge of ghostly fame, beyond which stood the grassy rise with the whitewashed church. So far, Gunpowder's wild panic had worked in Ichabod's favor, but just as they reached the middle of the hollow, the saddle girths gave way. Ichabod felt it slipping. He grabbed at the pommel, but the saddle fell. He barely managed to cling to Gunpowder's neck as the saddle was trampled behind him. For a fleeting moment, he heard Hans von Ripper's wrath, for it was his best Sunday saddle, but this was no time for such concerns. The goblin rider was gaining, and Ichabod, barely able to stay mounted, was bounced and battered with each jolt of the horse's spine. Suddenly, the trees opened. There was hope. A silver star's reflection shimmered on the brook ahead. The bridge! He could see the church walls beyond, glowing faintly through the trees. He remembered Brombone's tale. "If I can but reach that bridge," he thought, "I am safe." The black horse panted behind him. Ichabod thought he felt its hot breath. One last desperate kick, and Gunpowder leapt onto the bridge, thundering over its planks. They reached the far side. Ichabod turned to look, hoping to see the specter vanish in a flash of fire, but instead he saw the goblin rise up in his stirrups and hurl the head directly at him. Ichabod tried to dodge, but it was too late. The head struck him with a crushing blow. He tumbled into the dust, and the horse, goblin, and all swept past like a whirlwind. The next morning, the old horse, Gunpowder, was found grazing quietly at his master's gate, bridle underfoot, and saddle missing. Ichabod did not appear for breakfast, nor at dinner. The schoolhouse boys gathered idly by the brook. No schoolmaster. Hans von Ripper began to worry, for both Ichabod and his saddle. A search began. On the road to the church, they found the saddle, trampled into the dirt. Hoofprints, deep and furious, led to the bridge. Beyond that, near a wide pool in the brook, they found Ichabod's hat, and next to it, a shattered pumpkin. The brook was searched, but no body was found. Van Ripper, now acting as executor of Ichabod's modest estate, examined the contents of his bundle. 2.5 shirts, 2 neckstalks, a pair or 2 of worsted stockings, an old pair of corduroy breeches, a rusty razor, a dog-eared psalm book, and a broken pitch pipe. The schoolhouse furniture belonged to the community, except for 3 books: Cotton Mather's History of Witchcraft, a New England Almanac, and a Dream Interpretation Manual. In the latter was a heavily scribbled sheet of paper, failed poetic attempts in honor of Katrina Van Tassel. Van Ripper promptly threw all of this into the fire, vowing never again to send his children to school. He claimed no good ever came of too much reading and writing. Ichabod's disappearance caused quite a stir that Sunday. Groups gathered at the churchyard, bridge, and brook, whispering theories. Tales of Brower, Bones, and many others resurfaced. Let's step back one last time. Ichabod vanishes, and the world keeps turning. The fields are tilled, the pews are filled, the schoolhouse is swept and claimed by another. But what is buried in that silence? His disappearance is more than mystery. It's a mirror, a final image of a soul unanchored, a man drawn by appetite, undone by fear, and swallowed by a world that honors presence more than substance. He is not just lost, he is absorbed, replaced not because he was hated, but because he was hollow. And maybe deep down we fear the same fate, not to be punished, but to be forgotten without ever being known. Let's finish up the story. In the end, most concluded that the schoolmaster had been spirited away by the headless horseman. Since he was a bachelor and owed no debts, few pursued the matter. The school was moved to another part of the hollow, and a new teacher took Ichabod's place. Years later, a visiting old farmer from New York reported that Ichabod Crane was alive. He had fled the region, partly out of terror, partly out of embarrassment at Katrina's rejection. He had moved far away, taught school, studied law, and become a lawyer, dabbled in politics, written for newspapers, and eventually became a justice of the 10-pound court. As for Brom Bones, who shortly after married the blooming Katrina, he was often seen to smirk knowingly whenever the story was told. At the mention of the pumpkin, he laughed aloud, prompting some to suspect he knew more than he let on. But the old country wives, those wise keepers of tradition, insist to this day that Ichabod was taken by supernatural means. The bridge grew ever more feared, and the road was eventually rerouted to avoid it, skirting the mill pond instead. The abandoned schoolhouse soon fell to ruin, and to this day is said to be haunted by the ghost of the ill-fated schoolmaster. Many a lingering farm boy has claimed to hear his voice in the distance, singing a sad psalm tune among the quiet shadows of Sleepy Hollow. And so, what do we make of this tale? Some stories end not with answers, but with silence, with a lane left empty, a song half sung. Ichabod Crane rode into a dark night, and what followed was not proof, but a tale. And like so many tales in this country, it tells us less about what happened and more about what to believe. In Sleepy Hollow, we saw the young nation's anxieties, its hunger, its pride, its fear of being forgotten. But America's story doesn't end in flight. It keeps unfolding through conflict, through conscience, and through figures who rise when most would vanish. Next week, we move on from these haunted glens of New York to the old streets of Boston, where a cloaked stranger appears in a moment of crisis and vanishes before anyone can ask who or what he truly was. Join us for The Gray Companion, a story not of fear, but of judgment, of the moment when history shifts and something steps forward from the shadows to meet it. Thank you for listening to New American Mythos. If these stories have stirred something in you, one of the best ways to support the show is by joining our community on Patreon. At the first donation tier, you'll receive early access to all the episodes, plus 2 exclusive bonus episodes when the season concludes. At the second level, you'll receive a special gift in December, a free copy of this season's separate audiobook project, our modernized recording of Washington Irving's Old Christmas. And for our top-tier patrons, at the end of the season, you'll receive an early, limited edition signed copy of the bound collection of this season's myths, a tangible piece of the world that we're building together. Your support really does keep the lantern lit and ensures that these old stories can speak anew. Thank you for walking this road with us.